Late October, I was 43 and still adjusting to remote project management after a corporate downsizing that had rearranged my days without really changing my personality. I'd always worked best in quiet, in blocks of time I could control. 4 or 5 nights, I rented a privately owned cabin at the end of a gravel forestry road, bordered by state land, to review contracts and build a restructuring proposal due Monday. I told colleagues I'd have limited reception, but would check in nightly, the way adults do when they want solitude without inviting concern. Inside, the propane wall heater cycled on and off with a low hum that felt dependable. If you prefer realistic accounts like this, subscribe for more quiet, grounded horror. The owner communicated only through the booking app, short and efficient, like someone who had systematized distance. Check-in was a lockbox on the porch railing. The code was 0427. I arrived mid-afternoon and did what I always do in unfamiliar spaces, a practical inventory. Bottled water under the sink, a stacked cord of firewood beside the shed, a first aid kit in a kitchen drawer. I tested the stove, checked window latches, confirmed the deadbolt threw cleanly. The only inconvenience was the exterior motion light above the porch. It didn't activate even when I walked directly beneath it. I replaced the bulb from a spare in the utility closet and got the same result. Leaves skittered across the deck in intermittent gusts, dry and restless. The first morning, I took a mug of coffee outside and found the outdoor trash bin lid slightly ajar. I remembered pressing it down the night before until it clicked. The latch still looked intact. Raccoons made sense, and I didn't want to be someone who turned normal wildlife into a story. While I stood there, I noticed faint tire tracks in the dirt turnout near the road, shallow impressions that could have been days old. Public land drew hunters, hikers, utility trucks. I closed the lid and told myself the same thing I tell myself in airports and parking garages. Most patterns are coincidence. The damp earth smell rose as the sun warmed the clearing. Work settled into a rhythm. I drafted in the mornings, walked the property line after lunch, and cooked simply. The cabin's quiet had a texture: heater hum, refrigerator clicks, the soft creak of cooling wood at night. The second evening, around 7:40 p.m., I heard a vehicle engine somewhere beyond the trees. No headlights swept the windows, no crunch of tires on the driveway, just an idling sound held at a distance until it faded. The next night, it happened again at the same time. My phone briefly dropped to no service while the engine ran, then returned a minute later. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, a like helps me know to keep telling it this way. On the third night, when I stepped onto the porch earlier than usual, the porch chair was angled toward the tree line instead of facing the door. I'd left it square to the cabin. I repositioned it and told myself wind could do strange things to light furniture, even when it hadn't felt windy. The timing began to bother me more than the sound itself. The kitchen wall clock made it too easy to notice, 7:40, as if someone had set an alarm. One evening I went outside at 7:30 and waited, hands in my pockets, trying to make myself feel foolish. The forest felt held in suspension. No insects, no wind moving the branches, not even that ordinary background hiss you usually stop hearing once you're used to it. My breath showed in the cooling air. At exactly 7:40, the engine started somewhere close enough that I could feel a faint vibration through the porch boards. I stood very still and understood, with no proof, that this wasn't random. At 7:35 the next evening, I decided to drive out. The thought was simple: pass whatever it was on the road, force it into the open, remove the ambiguity. I had my keys in hand, laptop closed, jacket on. When I turned the ignition, the starter clicked once and the dashboard lights dimmed. The headlights flickered weakly like a tired blink and went out. A dead battery made no sense. I'd driven there that afternoon for groceries in town. I tried again and got the same thin click. I went back inside and shut off every light. The propane heater hummed, steady as ever. At 7:40, headlights flared briefly between the trees behind the cabin, too low and too narrow to be on the road. The engine idled closer than it had before. I heard gravel crunch softly in a place with no driveway. My phone showed no service. I stood in the dark kitchen, looking at the black rectangle of the window, and waited. Footsteps crossed the deck slowly. The porch board near the third plank from the left creaked, one distinct complaint of wood under controlled weight. The door handle shifted once, gently, as if someone was testing whether it would give. No rattling, no forcing. The latch vibrated with a faint metallic rattle under that careful pressure. Then the handle returned to neutral. The footsteps retreated. The engine didn't cut off. It faded gradually, as if whoever was there wanted me to hear it leaving. I stayed awake until midnight with every interior light off, moving only when I needed to, listening for any change in the house's normal sounds. Nothing else happened. When dawn flattened the clearing into muted gray, I went straight to the car. The hood was cold, beaded with moisture. The battery terminals were clean, no corrosion, no loose cables flapping. But the nut on one terminal was slightly unscrewed, just enough to interrupt contact without looking obvious at a glance. I tightened it with the small wrench from the trunk and sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine, as if delaying would change what it meant. I checked the clearing for footprints and found only disturbed leaves near the deck. Through the app, I messaged the owner about a maintenance concern. Back in town later that day, with reception steady, I pulled my phone's connection logs. The signal drops were recorded nightly at 7:39 p.m., consistent down to the minute. That kind of regularity belongs to schedules, not weather. At the cabin, I tested the motion light bulb by screwing it into a lamp inside. It worked immediately. I drove to the ranger station and asked, casually, about patrols on Forest Service Road 118. The answer was practical and unhelpful. Patrol vehicles didn't use that spur road. Before leaving, I checked the trash bin again and noticed something I'd missed. The lid had been wedged open with a flat gray stone, placed deliberately under the rim. I left 2 days early, citing work complications, and I didn't frame it as fear even to myself. The owner never replied beyond automated messages, the kind that thank you for staying and invite you to leave a review. Weeks later, I still wake occasionally at 7:40 p.m. and check the time before I remember where I am. What unsettles me most isn't the handle testing the lock. It's the precision, the sense that someone had learned my nights by listening. In my mind, that kitchen clock is frozen at 7:40, and the porch plank still creaks under a weight that never hurries. If you know someone who appreciates grounded horror told plainly, share this with them, and subscribe for the next account. Early spring thaw. I was 45 and newly separated, spending accumulated vacation days the way other people schedule repairs. Quietly and without ceremony. I rented a lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota to reset in a structured way. The area was seasonal. Most neighboring cabins were still shuttered, docks tilted slightly from winter ice. Mine was labeled Lot 12 on Birch Haven Road. I established a simple routine the first afternoon. Coffee at sunrise, a slow walk along the shoreline, reading in the afternoons with the windows cracked. Ice shifted against the dock with dull, intermittent knocks that sounded like someone testing the wood from beneath. If you appreciate realistic accounts told plainly, subscribe for more grounded horror. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Structured solitude was the point. No decisions beyond what to cook or when to turn in. The owner had left a binder on the kitchen table with laminated instructions. A note on page 3 explained that lake levels fluctuated during thaw and advised running the taps briefly each morning to keep the private well clear. I followed directions methodically. The only inconvenience was the water pressure pulsing irregularly at night, a soft shudder in the pipes before settling. After dark, the pipes ticked inside the walls as the temperature dropped. It was an ordinary kind of cabin noise, the sort that becomes background once you accept it. The first evening, while standing at the window with a book in my hand, I noticed faint ripples near the dock. There was no wind, and the trees along the shore stood completely still. I assumed fish rising or ice shifting beneath the surface. The next morning, the aluminum rowboat tied to the dock sat angled slightly outward from where I remembered leaving it. I'd secured it with a single blue nylon rope. The knot was still firm. I attributed the change to currents under melting ice. In early spring, water moves in ways that aren't always visible. The air remained motionless, without even a tremor in the branches. Each morning after that, the boat rested a little farther from its original position. Not dramatically, just inches. I retied the rope tightly, double knotting it and testing the tension with a firm pull. The knot never slipped. I began marking the edge of the dock with a pencil line aligned with the boat's stern, telling myself I was being precise rather than suspicious. 3 marks, each spaced 1 inch apart. By the third morning, the stern had drifted exactly to the second mark. The water lapped rhythmically, too evenly like breathing. One afternoon, sitting inside and watching through the glass, I considered how small adjustments can accumulate into something significant. If you prefer slow burn, realistic horror, a like lets me know. That night, I added a 4th pencil mark before going to bed, measuring carefully. The rope remained taut, leading straight down into dark water that reflected nothing back. I stayed awake past midnight on the fourth night, lights off, sitting at the kitchen table where I could see the dock through the window. The lake's surface appeared perfectly still, a flat black sheet. The digital clock on the stove glowed 1:12 a.m. when the movement began. The boat didn't sway or pivot. It shifted outward smoothly, almost gently. There was no splash. The rope tightened with a soft strain, as if tension were being applied from below rather than sideways. I felt it in my chest before I understood it intellectually. Water should resist. It should announce disturbance. This didn't. I told myself observation without verification becomes imagination. I took a flashlight from the drawer and stepped onto the dock. The boards were damp but stable. The beam cut across the aluminum hull, reflecting back in a hard white line. The water beyond it was dark and depthless, surface unbroken. I crouched to inspect the rope. As I leaned forward to adjust the knot, the tension increased sharply, so suddenly it startled my hand. The stern of the boat jerked downward, not away from the dock but toward the lake's floor. The aluminum dipped below the surface for a second, then strained upward again. The rope slid through my palm, fibers biting into skin. I tried to brace myself, but my right foot slipped between two dock planks where the boards had separated slightly from winter swelling. Cold lake water seeped instantly through my shoe as the rope pulled harder, drawing the bow downward in a controlled motion. There was no thrashing, no chaotic movement, just steady force. I lost my balance forward and felt the weight of my body begin to follow the rope's angle. I grabbed the dock edge with my free hand and pulled back. In the same instant, the tension went slack. Completely slack. The boat rose to its previous position without rocking. The surface of the lake flattened within seconds. No wake spread outward. No bubbles rose. The only evidence was the wetness in my shoe and the sting across my palm. The flashlight beam trembled briefly over the aluminum hull, then steadied. At dawn, under a windless sky that pressed down heavily on the clearing, I cut the rope with the small knife from the kitchen drawer. The slice was clean, deliberate. I dragged the boat fully ashore, away from the waterline, until its stern rested on dry ground. I photographed the dock, the rope ends, and the lake surface for reasons I couldn't clearly articulate. The binder's depth charts showed nothing unusual for that shoreline, gradual decline, no sudden drop-offs near the dock's 12-foot extension. I slept poorly that night, but stayed one more evening out of stubbornness, unwilling to let a single unexplained event dictate my departure. On my final morning, I walked down to the shoreline and saw wet drag marks leading from the water toward the dock. They were not boot prints. Two parallel grooves, clean and defined, cut through the sand and stopped at the dock's edge. I measured them with the pencil from my pocket, exactly 4 inches apart. The pencil marks I had made on the dock were gone, erased by dampness that hadn't come from rainfall. The wood smelled wet despite a clear sky. The boat, now fully ashore, showed no new marks on its hull. I never told the owner about the rope. I framed my early departure as a scheduling decision and left it there. Occasionally, out of habit, I checked satellite images of Birch Haven Road. The dock at Lot 12 still extends 12 feet into the lake, unchanged. What unsettles me isn't that something pulled. It's the measured way it did so, controlled, deliberate, patient. The lake did not behave like water. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who values grounded horror, and subscribe for the next one. Late summer. I was 42 and already feeling the pressure build ahead of trial prep. I'm a corporate attorney, and my work tends to expand to fill whatever space I give it, so I rented a mountain cabin in western North Carolina for a week of focused writing. It sat halfway up a ridge with a long gravel driveway, about 300 yards uphill, just far enough from anything to make distractions inconvenient. I kept structured hours the way I always do, drafting from 8 to 6, short evening walks, lights out at a reasonable time. Cicadas droned steadily through the open screened windows, a constant layer of sound that made the cabin feel occupied even when it wasn't. If you prefer realistic horror accounts told quietly, subscribe for more. I needed distance from city noise, from interruptions, from the casual friction of other people. The owner's message was brief and practical, with a warning about occasional black bears and a reminder to secure trash. Internet came from a satellite dish mounted behind the cabin. The modem on the desk was labeled HughesNet HT2000W, a beige block with small indicator lights. The first night, I unplugged it to reduce glare while I read in bed. The lights flickered anyway, soft, irregular pulses like a machine trying to remember it had been turned off. When I leaned close, there was a faint electrical hum from the casing, too steady to ignore. I checked the outlet, the power strip, the cord. Unplugged meant unplugged. I told myself it was residual charge, a cheap unit, nothing worth turning into a problem. My first evening walk took me down the driveway far enough to see the turnoff and the tree line. The gravel near the lower bend looked freshly disturbed, as if a vehicle had recently turned around or backed in. I assumed the prior renter had left late, or a maintenance truck had come through. In the morning, when I stepped outside with coffee, my car sat angled slightly differently than I remembered, just a few degrees, as if the front wheels had been corrected. The rear tire rested against a flat white stone embedded in the gravel. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to reconstruct my arrival in my head. Memory is sloppy with minor details. I decided not to indulge the feeling. By the second day, I was deep into drafting and grateful for the solitude. The ridge held heat in the afternoons, and the cabin creaked faintly as it expanded. Around 3:15 p.m., the internet cut out briefly. It returned within a minute, so I didn't think much of it. Satellite service is imperfect. But during the outage, the cicadas stopped abruptly. The sudden absence of sound made the room feel exposed. In that quiet, I heard a faint knocking traveling through the cabin frame. Not loud, more like someone tapping wood with a knuckle somewhere below the floor. The next afternoon, the same pattern. 3:15, outage, cicadas stopping, knocking. I inspected the crawlspace access hatch in the hallway closet. It was secured and, more importantly, locked from inside with a simple latch that couldn't be reached externally. The driveway began to bother me as well. Each morning there were new shallow impressions along the edge, too narrow for tires, too evenly spaced for random animal movement. I started photographing the driveway before work and after, and my phone timestamps kept landing at 3:16 p.m. when I checked again. On the fourth day, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the photos side by side. The impressions weren't scattered. They formed a straight path from the driveway's edge toward the crawlspace vent on the side of the cabin. Not tire tracks, not paw prints. The spacing was consistent, close to a human stride length. What made my stomach tighten wasn't the shape, it was the timing. The path appeared only on days with the 3:15 outage, then vanished by morning, as if the gravel had been brushed smooth overnight. I went outside and looked closely at the vent. It was secured by 4 screws, cleanly seated, no visible tampering. From inside, the cabin felt normal again as soon as the internet returned, like a room that exhales after holding its breath. The silence right before the modem's reconnect tone began to feel deliberate. The next afternoon, I decided to remove variables. At 3:05, I disconnected the modem entirely, power, coax, everything, then set it on the table like evidence. I watched my wristwatch, not the computer. At 3:14, the cicadas stopped. Not gradually. They ceased in unison, leaving a vacuum of sound that made me aware of my own breathing. Then the knocking began beneath the floorboards, slow and rhythmic, as if a measured hand were moving along beams. I stood still, shoes planted, and listened. The knocks traveled laterally under the living room, crossing from left to right with steady spacing. The wood floor vibrated subtly beneath my feet, not enough to see, enough to feel through the soles. The crawlspace vent rattled once, a brief metallic tremor, then settled. I moved quietly to the back door and stepped outside. The driveway was empty. No vehicle. No figure. The air felt thick with heat and stillness. I walked along the side of the cabin toward the vent, keeping my steps light on the pine needles and gravel. When I crouched near the vent slats, I saw faint movement inside. Not a shape I could identify, more like a shadow shifting against darkness, as if something had adjusted position in response to my presence. Before I could get closer, the satellite dish cable behind the cabin jerked slightly, a quick tug like a line being tested. At 3:17, the knocking stopped instantly. The cicadas resumed as if someone had flipped a switch. Inside, the computer chimed, an internet reconnection sound, though the modem remained unplugged on the table. I stayed where I was, still crouched, and did not open the crawlspace. That evening, I packed essential items with a careful calm I didn't entirely recognize in myself. Laptop, charger, documents, keys, wallet, a bottle of water. I didn't make a show of it, didn't rush, but I kept my eyes moving between windows as I worked. I drove downhill and parked where the driveway met the trees, doors locked, seat reclined just enough to rest without sleeping deeply. The ridge was cooler at night, and mist gathered low. I watched headlights that never came and listened to the cabin settle above me. At sunrise, I returned only long enough to check the crawlspace vent from a distance. 2 screws were missing entirely. The remaining one set slightly loosened, as if someone had backed them out partway and then stopped. There was no visible entry hole, no torn screen, nothing dramatic, just hardware altered with patience. Later, from a hotel with stable Wi-Fi, I reviewed the modem logs. The connection history showed continuous uptime at 3:15 p.m. No interruption recorded, no drop, nothing that matched my experience. My phone photos, meanwhile, showed the driveway impressions clearly forming a path, then disappearing overnight between frames, as if the gravel had been smoothed deliberately. The owner responded through the booking app that no maintenance visits occurred during my stay. A satellite dish technician I contacted out of caution stated plainly that a disconnected cable cannot transmit a signal, and a modem without power cannot reconnect. The static hiss I remembered from those outages replayed in my mind anyway, like a memory trying to overwrite a record. I finished my legal draft from that hotel and submitted it on time, which is the kind of detail people assume matters most. I never opened the crawlspace. What troubles me isn't what might have been beneath the cabin. It's the idea that something synchronized itself with my work schedule. 3:15, every day, as if my structure had invited a response. Even now, when my afternoon calendar hits that time, I sometimes hear an imagined knock aligning with it, and I picture that 300-yard driveway stretching downhill into trees that don't move. If you know someone who appreciates grounded horror told without spectacle, share this with them and subscribe for the next account.